Hi, everybody. Welcome to our next lesson. This one's going to be on the creation of the Constitution, the United States Constitution. So, in our previous lesson, we took a look at the Articles of Confederation, which created the very first government of the independent United States of America. But that video ended with delegates meeting to discuss some of the problems that they were experiencing under the Articles of Confederation and trying to come up with something better. And so this is what happened. They created the United States Constitution. So let's take a look at how this went down. So the convention met in Philadelphia. It started in May of 1787, and they met in the Philadelphia State House, which today is known as Independence Hall. And this on the left is a picture. This is the very same building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed all the way back in 1776. So there's a lot of history in this hall already. And today you're going to learn there's even more history with it. So an important thing to keep in mind when they were having this convention in Independence Hall back in in 1787, the windows in this building were closed. Despite the heat during the early summer, right, in May. They were meeting in May, June, and July, also into August of 1787, actually into September. And so pretty much the entire summer. And they closed the windows to the building so that nobody could eavesdrop on their conversations, on their meetings, and hear what they were saying. So I want to remind you, though, that this was in the days well before air conditioning existed, right? And even before automatic fans. And inside this room, we do have a picture. Inside this room, you can see, you can still go see it today. This is what it looks like. And this is very similar to what it looked like in 1787. But remember, of course, the windows were closed. So there was no breeze coming in, right? So, the question now is, who was there? Well, all the states were represented except for Rhode Island, right? They didn't send anybody to the convention. You had 55 total delegates. You had lawyers, merchants, planters. Most of them were pretty wealthy. They were well educated. Most were between the ages of 30 and 40. The oldest of the delegates was Benjamin Franklin, whom we've heard about before. And the youngest of the delegates was a man from South Carolina who was in his 20s. And this convention included folks like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, who is known as the father of the Constitution. Also, George Mason, Roger Sherman. They were very well known Americans. And George Washington, no surprise to anyone, he was chosen to preside over the meeting. And this was chosen by unanimous vote because just so many people respected him, right? And here is an imaginary painting of what it would have looked like, right? If all the delegates had been there at the same time. Here's another picture, right? Remember, this is just an imagined picture. This isn't, they didn't have actual photos back then, right? So, but again, the windows were closed, as you can see in this room. It was exhaustingly hot. Uh, there's no way that they all would have been dressed as they are in this painting, right? Given it was that hot. And so when they were there, they had some issues that they discussed. Originally, they were there to revise and just make some changes to the Articles of Confederation. So they were going to keep the Articles at first and just kind of alter it. But after 5 days, they realized they're going to have to make a new government. Revising the Articles was not going to be enough. So there are some key issues that they they discussed, right? And they needed to know, first, how are you going to provide fair representation for all the states, big states versus small states, for instance, big populations, small populations. How is that going to work out? Also, what about slaves and slavery? This was a matter of North versus Southern states, slave states versus free states. You had slave owners, some of the biggest slave holders at the Constitutional Convention, and you had some outspoken abolitionists, people who wanted slavery to not exist in the United States. So you can see that there was going to be some tension there. How about balancing power between the national and state governments? Who's going to be more powerful? How do you balance the power between the branches of government? And finally, who can participate in this new government? Can everybody participate? Can all men participate? What about slaves? What about free blacks? Are they able to participate? So we're going to take a look at these one by one. So first, we have of the large states versus small states. How do you balance the power between those different states and their populations? One proposal was the Virginia Plan, and it was proposed by James Madison. And he proposed a bicameral legislature, bicameral. And that means a two-house legislature, right? With representation in both houses based on population. So the larger your state, the more representation you had. The smaller your state, the less representation you had. And this was countered by the New Jersey Plan by William Patterson. He presented an idea that you have a single house, just one house, with only one representative per state. So it didn't matter how big your state was, each state only had one representative. And so there was a deadlock. They couldn't agree, right? They couldn't decide between these two plans. And this deadlock was broken eventually by what we call the Great Compromise. And this Great Compromise, was created by a man named Roger Sherman. And this compromise created a bicameral, a two-house legislature, but there are differences between them. So you had the Senate, which was the upper house, that's what we call it, the Senate, where each state had two representatives. And these representatives were chosen by the state legislatures. And then you had the House of Representatives, that's the lower house. And in this representative body was based on population. And those representatives were elected by popular vote. So they were voted directly by the people. So now, here is an image that will kind of give you an idea. So you can see in this Great Compromise, you have two different houses. And you have one house that represents all the states based on population. And you can see here, it's kind of blurry, but that pink state is Virginia. And Virginia had a large population. And so states with larger populations would therefore have more representatives in the lower house, in the House of Representatives. And then you had other states like New Jersey, for example, which were smaller. They had lower populations. And in the upper house, in the upper body, right, you have the Senate. And the Senate, they would have equal representation. So no matter how many people lived in the different states, all the states in the Senate had the same number of representatives. And they were chosen by the state legislatures. So let's take a look at the issue of slave or southern states versus free and northern states. I'm going to remind you that there were northern states that did still have slavery at this time. Places like New York actually allowed slavery. States like Maryland and Delaware, which today we might think of as more northern states, they actually had slaves. They were considered southern states. So the question was, how do you balance that power between slave and non-slave states? And if representation is going to be based on population, as it's going to be in the House of Representatives, which we just learned, The question is, do slaves count as people? Because if you count the slaves as people, then that brings up a lot more ethical questions, right? So this could affect the number of representatives a state could have in the House of Representatives. And so they needed to resolve this question, and they eventually agreed to what's known today as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And this is an infamous compromise, especially today. And what they said was that 3/5 of states' slaves would count towards representation. And this gave more power to the southern or the slaveholding states. This would also count, though, for taxes. So the 3/5, it would count for population. It would also count for tax purposes, which meant that the northern states would get some financial benefit from the extra tax money that the slave states were paying Congress in addition. So in addition was Congress was given the power to regulate or end the slave trade, but they would have to wait at least 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. So they had to wait until after the Constitution was ratified for 20 years before they could take legal action and put an end to slavery. And so importing of slaves, the international slave trade, was eventually banned in 1808 by Congress, 20 years after the Constitution was ratified. So this compromise, this promise in the compromise did come true. 20 years later, they did ban international importing of slaves. So taking slaves from foreign countries and bringing them in. So we'll take a look at this in class again a little bit later, a little bit more in depth. But this is one of the most infamous compromises in the Constitution. And it also made the interstate trade of slaves legal. It allowed that for that. So international trade of slaves was illegal, but interstate trade, which is trade within the United States, it was still legal. So you could trade a slave across state lines from, let's say, Virginia to Pennsylvania, right? That was still legal during this time. So let's take a look at central versus state governments. So the question is the national government going to have more power, or are the states going to have more power? So the Constitution created a new form of federalism. This is a type of government where power is divided between the national government and the state government. And this is actually what we have today. So what you have are delegated or enumerated powers, and these are powers that are given specifically to the national government. Enumerated means they are made clear, they are written out. And delegated means they are specifically given to the national government. And these are powers like dealing with foreign affairs, providing for the national defense, so having a national army, right? Interstate trade, regulating trade between the states, and also coining money. So one of the problems of the Articles of Confederation is you had 13 states, so you had 13 types of currency. Whereas under the new Constitution, only the federal government would make money, right? Then you'd have these reserved powers, and these powers that were, these reserved powers were kept or reserved by the states. These included things like education. So what education policies are, they're going to be established in your state on a state-by-state basis. And intrastate trade, so trade between cities within a single state, those are handled by the states as well. So both, and then the other thing is both levels of government, both national or central government and the state government, they can borrow money, they can tax, and they can also pay debts. And the key thing to remember is that the authority to do this, the authority of federalism, of having national authority and state authority, these are derived from we the people, not from the states. So the really important thing to remember is that the national government, the United States government, doesn't get its authority from the states, it gets it from the people. So remember that. The first words of the Constitution are "we the people" and not "we the states." It's not "we the delegates of the states." This is a very important difference. It's a philosophical difference from the Articles of Confederation. So let's take a look at this picture here. This is a Venn diagram. I'm sure you've seen plenty of these before. So this kind of makes it. If you want to pause and take a look, I'll just read through some of them. So you can see there are certain powers that are the prerogative, the power that belongs to the national government, and those that belong to the state. And then there are a few that are shared, right? And so remember, the reserved powers are the ones on the right. They're the ones that belong to exclusively to states, state governments. And then you have the delegated powers, which are delegated to the national government. So the ones that are delegated to the national government, like I said, declare war, establish foreign policy, admit new states, regulate interstate trade and foreign trade. And compare that with the states. The states' reserved powers. They can make marriage laws, provide for public safety, establish local governments, and establish and maintain schools. And then in the middle there you have some shared powers like establishing courts. Both can charter banks, borrow money. They can levy taxes, like I said, and provide for public welfare. Right. So let's take a look at now central government versus central government. And this is going to sound strange, but you'll see it'll make sense in just a second. So how do you balance power? This is the important question. How do you balance power within the central or national government and keep one branch of government from becoming too powerful? And we see that you separate the powers. This is what we did in the Constitution. And we got this idea from Baron de Montesquieu. Remember Montesquieu in our previous lessons? He argued for this, for separating and having multiple branches of government. Well, we adopted this and we put this into the Constitution. So when you divide the power between the three branches, first of all, you have the legislative branch. This is the branch that makes the laws, right? And this is like the House of Representatives, the Senate that we have today. Those are the legislative branch together. Then you have the executive branch, and it's led by the president. And this branch carries out and enforces the law or executes the law. And then you have the judicial branch. This branch of government interprets laws via the court system. So from lower courts all the way up to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., there's these courts, they all have the job of interpreting the law and determining what is legal, what is constitutional. And this system of having separate branches, it's called separation of powers. And then there's also this system known as checks and balances. And basically it means that we keep one branch of government from dominating the others. So for instance, the legislature has to make laws. The executive has to sign a law into existence for it to actually be enforced, right? But they can also be made. The legislature can also override the president. The president might have a veto and strike down a law and prevent it from being passed by the Congress. And the Congress has the power to override his vetoes. And the judicial branch can also strike down laws as unconstitutional. So here is a graphic to help you kind of see how these checks and balances work. So you can see, I'll start with the legislative. So the legislative branch, they approve nominations, they appropriate money, so they get to determine how money is spent, what money is spent, and they can impeach the president. Those are some of their powers that they can use to try to check the power of the executive branch. And the executive, the president, he has the power in return to veto legislation. So laws that are passed by the Congress, the president can block them and not sign them. But we know the legislative branch can overcome that. They can combat that. And if they get enough members of Congress to vote for the law, they can actually overturn his veto. So those are just some examples. You can also see that the legislative and judicial also provide checks on one another. So, for example, the Congress can impeach judges, they can remove them from their positions, whereas the judicial branch can declare laws that were passed by the Congress to be unconstitutional and strike them down. The judicial branch can do the same thing to the president. They can declare presidential acts to be unconstitutional. On the other hand, the executive, they get some influence. The president gets to nominate judges to the judicial branch. So technically, he could put in judges that are a little more favorable. He or she could nominate judges that are more favorable to their policies. So you can see this is how the checks and balances are supposed to work. This is how these three branches are able to block one another if they need to prevent just one branch of government from becoming too powerful, right? So let's go to the next one. So we have the Electoral College, right? So the Constitution, in the Constitution, we created something that had a lot of effects in the lifetime, in our lifetimes, in the history of this country. And the writers of the Constitution did not want the popular vote to have too much influence. So we still have this still affects our elections to this day. They didn't want the popular vote to have too much influence. They were afraid that a tyrant or a dictator could easily persuade people to elect them and get the masses, the mobs of people to fall in love with them and elect them, right? And so they created the Electoral College, this institution, and it's supposed to have the final say on who's elected president. And these electors, they're chosen by state legislatures, and the number of electors for each state equals the number of senators and representatives in each state. So the larger the state, the more electors you have. And just so you know, for example, California, as you can see on this map, has the most electors of any state. And that's because we have the largest population of any state in the country. So we have the most representatives in the lower house. And then when you take that number of representatives and add it to our 2 senators, we have the most electors in the Electoral College across the entire country. So like I said, the larger the state, the more electors you have, and they cast their ballots after the popular election has taken place, after the popular election results were reported. And usually when the electors in the Electoral College vote, this reflects the popular vote, right? However, there have been presidents that have been elected without winning the popular vote, and they include presidents like John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, most recently. Donald Trump did not win the popular vote. Nevertheless, he did win easily the Electoral College. So that is why he was elected president, because he won the his number of states that he won had the most Electoral College votes. So here is a quick overview of the Constitution, just so you know how our Constitution is structured. So it begins with the preamble. The preamble, it's like the introduction. And the preamble starts with the "we the people" part, which makes clear that the power that underlies the Constitution comes from the people, not from the states. Article 1 of the Constitution focuses on the legislative branch, the Congress. And it's supposed to be the most powerful branch of the government since they make the law, technically. But it is kept in check, like I said. And then you have Article 2, which focuses on the executive branch, which is led by the president. Article 3 focuses on the judiciary branch of government, so the Supreme Court and other federal courts. Article 4 deals with relations among the states. How do they resolve issues with each other? And then Article 5 deals with amending the Constitution, altering the Constitution. How do you change the Constitution? That is talked about in Article 5. How do you add something to it? How do you take something out that exists in it. And then Article 6, it makes clear the supremacy of the national government. The national government is more powerful than the state governments. Although this was not easily accepted or viewed as such by a lot of Americans. In fact, it's one of the reasons we have a civil war was over the argument over who was superior in national government or state governments in regards to the issue of slavery, right? And finally, Article 7 explained ratification. How is it that the Constitution was going to be approved and officially adopted to become the law of the land? So the new Constitution, as you can see on the right here, you can go to the National Archives and see it in person in Washington, D.C. I've seen it for myself. It's actually pretty cool. It was signed by 39 of the original 55 delegates. So not everybody who was at the Constitutional Convention actually signed it, but a majority of them did. And the official recognition day of it being signed and ratified is September 17th, 1787. The final approval, though, was left to the states, right? 9 of the 13 states had to ratify it for it to take place. So, to take effect, I mean. So, on September 17th, 1787 is when the Constitutional Convention voted on it, approved it, they recognized it, but it wasn't ratified officially until 9 of the 13 states had voted to ratify it. And the goal of the supporters of the Constitution was to have all 13 states at the time ratify it. Otherwise, they were afraid that maybe cracks would show and there would be disagreement, right? And that without everybody buying into it, eventually it might create a divisive country, right? So that's it for this lesson. Next, we're really going to take a look at there was a fight to not only ratify the Constitution, but there were disagreements between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists over whether or not there should be a Bill of Rights. So we'll continue working on learning about the beginnings of the country. Let me know if you have any questions at all. Good luck on the assignment, and thank you.